Welcome to another episode of Hunters and Unicorns, the Sales Leaders Playbook. It is with great honor that we welcome to the show Vance Loiselle. Vance was the co-founder of BladeLogic, the greatest success story in the history of software sales. He has since taken CEO positions at companies like Sumo Logic and is now the chief exec and president at PropertyBase, a disruptive real estate technology company. In this episode, we discover Vance's ability to adapt to different roles in the chaos of a startup environment to become the revered executive leader he is today. This is his playbook.
Edition series, the 33 CxOs, we investigate one of the greatest success stories in the history of software sales. 33 CxOs learnt the playbook from one man, John McMahon, a legacy which stretches back to the late 90s at a company called PTC. They were later reunited at BladeLogic, which was acquired by BMC. What happened next was truly remarkable. These CxOs went on to become the most prolific sales leaders in the software industry. They've raised over 22 billion in VC funding. They contribute to 4% of software turnover globally, 26 unicorns, 8 decacorns, and the companies they drive have a combined valuation of 230 billion. At Hunters and Unicorn, we're revealing their playbook.
Welcome to Hunters and Unicorns. I'm Simon Kutis and I'm joined by my co-host, Ollie Kune.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And it's a real honor and privilege to welcome Vance Loiselle.
Thanks, guys. Ollie, Simon, appreciate the opportunity.
Welcome to the show, Vance.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's an exclusive opportunity. I heard you guys are doing this. I felt left out, so I had to wiggle my way in.
The show wouldn't be complete without you, Vance.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Appreciate it.
So for our guests and for our, do you know what? I'm gonna start again.
What was wrong with that?
Honestly.
He just stubbed his toe. It's all right.
Yeah. Okay. It's been a long day.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Oh, okay. Welcome to Hunters and Unicorns. I'm Simon Kutis and I'm joined by my co-host, Ollie Kune.
Hey, everyone.
And it's an absolute honor and privilege to welcome Vance Loiselle. Vance, welcome to the show.
Simon, thank you. Ollie, real pleasure to be here.
Welcome to the show, Vance.
For our listeners
great.
and for our viewers today, Vance Loiselle, President and CEO of PropertyBase, former President and CEO of Sumo Logic, and most significantly, for the context of this series, co-founder of BladeLogic. What an absolute honor to have you on the show. Now, Vance, could you start off by just telling us a little bit about your current role at PropertyBase?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Simon. I mean, PropertyBase is the leading software provider to the real estate industry. So if you think of, brokerages, agents, even the mortgage sector, all of those people, millions of them in the US and, we're in 50 countries, are looking for software to, drive their top line and drive their growth. And they use all of our data and SaaS software to help do everything from drive leads to close deals.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible journey that you've been on. And we are going to talk a lot more about PropertyBase because you are obviously building something which is, very special and, really looking forward to going through that with you. But needless to say, it has been a stellar career, multiple CEO positions, some significant positions throughout your journey so far. But I suppose where I'd really like to start today is understand the background. How do you view yourself in terms of your kind of your background and your kind of skills? Are you a technology guy? You're an accountant? What is your background?
Yeah, I would say I'm people use fancy terms like entrepreneur and things like that. I mean, I really think of myself as a, as a sales guy with a technology background. Everything that I've done in my career has been driven by technology, and sales is something that I've been lucky enough to, pick up in, since the BladeLogic days and my exposure to people like John McMahon and others.
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously you graduated from university. Did you know what you wanted to do out of university, or how did things kind of manifest? How did they play out?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, I'm going to go back just a little earlier because it all that's what drove it. When I was a kid, I grew up in Maine, which is this tiny state in the top corner of the United States. I came from a lower middle class upbringing. My dad had started a company that basically manufactures hats, for lack of better terms. So back in the old days, in the 80s, that's how old I am. They had this fad, which were these things called painters hats, which painters would buy, and my dad was in the paint industry, and he was a sales guy, and he basically realized, like, oh, I could sell these to everybody. And so he got a contract with the NFL, with Michael Jackson tour, with Major League Baseball. And to that point, he did not have a business. And the business started in our house when I was 10. So on weekends, I'd be down at like 6 a.m. and I would sew visors on hats, and I would silk screen, and you name it, to get the business off the ground. Well, when I was 14, he had a MIT guy come in who worked at the local university to put in a software system to do everything from graphics to order entry. And back in those days, it was nerdy stuff like Unix and COBOL and C and all those nerdy technologies. And the thing never worked. And he had gotten a grant from the Small Business Administration of the United States, and he had to justify the loan to them like a year later. So when I started high school and I was 15, he said, hey, dude, you got to go figure this out. Like, you got to go make this work. And I didn't know anything. I had a Commodore 64. And so I picked up a book on COBOL, a book on C, and a book on Unix. And I fixed the software, programmed a bunch of it, got the servers working. This is back in the 80s, 85, 86. And it was good enough to get the Small Business Administration to sign off on the second version of the loan. So from that point forward, when I was 15, and even before I even thought what I was going to do for college, I knew, like, this is cool. Like, software is neat. I don't know if it's a thing that I can do outside of this. So I ended up going to a business-oriented small business school called Babson. And I took every possible computer science course that I could. But they didn't really have a computer science major there. So I asked my dad, like, hey, what skills should I get? He's like, well, everybody needs accountants. So I got an accounting and computer science degree. It was called information systems back then. And so when I applied to go to my first job, and I paid my own way through college because my dad was still trying to make payroll. I played a sport there. I worked 40 hours a week. I basically, when I got out, I said, geez, I really want to figure out how I can go do more of the software thing, but I didn't know it was called software at the time. I just knew there was like some technology. And in my area, Digital Equipment Corporation was a big thing, right? That was like pre-Compaq and all that. And they had helicopters. So they would like fly to you at your school, pick you up, and fly you to the campus to get interviewed in a helicopter. And everyone's like, oh, we got to go work at Digital Equipment Company. Well, I went to an interview there, and something didn't feel right about it, but I bumped into somebody else from another university, and we just got talking, and they said, oh, I'm going to go. I have another interview next week at Anderson Consulting. And I'm like, oh, what's that? And isn't that like auditing? I don't really want to do auditing. And they're like, no, that's Arthur Anderson, their sister company. Actually, you fly around the world and you work on computer systems. I'm like, how'd you get the interview? Like, so I just started cold calling the recruiting office at Anderson Consulting in Boston. And they're like, well, no, you had to, sign up like 4 months ago. And I said, well, how am I supposed to do that? I didn't know. And this is before the internet. I'm like, you didn't come to my campus. Like, you have to meet me. And I kind of gave him my elevator pitch. And so the woman agreed, this was like an admin, agreed to get me into the interview schedule in the next week. And so literally I interviewed at Anderson Consulting, and I got a job. And it was back in 1991. It was really hard to get jobs, but I was one of the only kids on the school bus who actually knew how to program in multiple languages. You know, as scary as that is, because there's MIT people and all that stuff, and I'm not even close to their level. But I talked my way through. They liked my grit and the fact that I could actually contribute on day one. And so I started my career at Anderson Consulting, and you know, sorry for the long-winded background, but it really kind of shaped what brought me here today. And once I got there, you know, it was amazing because out of the gate, you know, we'll talk about BladeLogic and the PTC heritage and all that. But what was great about Anderson Consulting is, you know, they take basically tens of thousands of kids and they put them through training like crazy. Your first 8 weeks, it was 6 weeks and it moved to 8 weeks. You're basically in a boot camp. You learn, they assume everybody is like a history or an art major and doesn't know anything about computers. So you go through an in-person boot camp in your local office, in my case, Boston, and then they fly you to their what's called CAPS in Chicago. And you go through a rigorous training, and they would, you know, basically kick somebody out every 2 days, you know, and they'd start the thing off and say, hey, you know, the 1,000 people in this room, look to your left, look to your right. You know, one of those people will not be here at the end of this. So you kind of immediately realize like, okay, this is, you know, we're playing a game here, like game's on and we got to win. And so you basically grind like 16 hours a day doing programming, nerdy COBOL. You got to, back in those days, you had to submit your software in punch cards and they run it overnight. And if you had one error, your whole day's work was failed and you had to figure out what to do. So it was a great indoctrination to me on like, hey, this is a meritocracy. You know, you're going to get trained and we're going to give you the tools, but everything else is up to you and you got to go figure it out. So, you know, my first project at that company, and you would get staffed on different projects. My first project was to go work on like a new retail brokerage trading platform at Fidelity Investments. Now, this is back when quotes were being provided over the phone, right? Pre-internet. This is 94, 93. And so I put in like a retail brokerage, you know, trading platform for end users, and they have a bunch of different businesses that actually had to connect to a phone-based dialer and grab quotes. And so I, you know, give quotes, and then, you know, you could actually do basic trades, not even basket orders. And I ran that project. You know, I'm 22. I had, you know, 2 mid-40s guys who were my programming team. And then I had a handful of client people I had to work with. But right out of the gate, like any immaturity or shyness or cluelessness, you figure out how to hide it or overcome it quickly in that environment. And your whole goal, you're just, you know, marching to, how do I get to be a senior consultant? How do I get to be a manager? And, you know, and quickly in 4.5 years, I became a manager. And then one of my associate partners who had left, you know, probably a year before that, went to another, you know, fixed fee consulting firm. And he called me out of the blue and he said, hey, how'd you like to come join this company I'm going to start? You know, be my first employee. I've got 2 others that I'm starting this with. And we're going to go do like really high-end projects. You know, this internet thing's new. We're going to do e-commerce and internet and CRM, you know, back in this is 97. And that's basically how things started.
Wow.
Wow.
So to take us through that journey, because obviously, you know, in 1997, Egg Rock Partners, and just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the guy, great guy, Omaton, guy named Mike Mortis, was the associate partner. Started this company with 2 other folks, VJ and Ellen. And I joined on day one with one other guy. And literally the first, I think within 2 weeks, this is based in Boston, it's called Egg Rock. And there's a reason behind the Egg Rock I'm not going to get into. But myself and one other guy had joined as first employees. And within 2 weeks, Mike had said, hey, we got our first big client. You know, it's this woman and this other guy who left Marriott and Avis, and they're starting this new internet travel company down in Florida. So you're going to go move to Florida and start our Southeast region. I'm like, okay, I should probably, at the time I just got married. And had I even gotten married? No, I just got married. And I'm like, okay, let's go. So I went down and I staffed this project and hired a handful of people. And that was my first experience really kind of building something on my own. Because, it's a different animal. Like Accenture's 50, 60,000 people, I think at the time. All of a sudden we're 5 people, right? It's a startup. It's not venture backed, it's bootstrapped, right? So, everything from, okay, can I go buy a laptop? How much can I pay for my apartment? Like basic stuff you just figure out you have to go do. And then we did that. And very quickly what happened was we started partnering on one of the competitors back in the early pre-Salesforce days in the CRM space. We built our own internet-based CRM on top of another company's platform. And so that was my first experience kind of building a product that was, under the covers embedded another product. And all of our customers, we started to sell that, and all of our customers said, well, where are we going to host this? Where are we going to put it? And so I basically started a hosting practice and a hosting business, with that company, back way before cloud or anything like that. It's like, okay, we need to put our software someplace. And back in those days, you had like, I can't remember some of the names of the company, the Exoduses, which is no longer around, these big data centers, and you would, spend tons on hardware and you'd manage all that stuff. So that was my first, experience with, things that are more infrastructure centric and data center centric. And, that was, we actually, because we started that hosting business, we needed to get a round of funding. And so this was like the internet was just starting. Battery Ventures came in and said, hey, we'll give you X amount of millions to go start this hosting thing. And then, within, I think 4 months, we got acquired by our competitor Breakaway. And that company was already public, not much bigger than us. And I remember the first day, Battery made out like a champ back in those days when millions was good money. And Battery, after that, we got acquired. The first day, the stock doubled. They made an acquisition. Usually stock goes down, the stock doubled. Then the next week, the stock doubled again. So all these paper internet money was being made. And, that was probably, other than the decision, put marrying my wife aside, the decision to, leave Accenture and go to EggRock was a huge decision for me, just career-wise, because, it goes back to one of my first items in the playbook, which is, you got to find, the right market, but you got to find the right people, right? And you got to align yourself with those people. And, when Mike pulled me to go to EggRock and then we went to Breakaway, then the second real stroke of luck hit, which was, Breakaway had already acquired another small hosting business, which myself and my small team at EggRock, was going to go over and be part of, right? And the guy who ran that business was David Echeria, who's basically the founder of BladeLogic, right? The co-founder of BladeLogic. And so I basically worked for Dave. And, for lack of a better term, I'll probably pump myself up a little more than I should. But, I kind of basically, in some ways on things business oriented, I kind of became, partially his right-hand guy. If there were sales pitches or investor pitches that, he couldn't go to, he'd have me go. Because I had a good mix of both, go to market and business acumen, but I also understood the technology we were providing. And, did that, but that was quick because all of a sudden, the internet explosion ended with an implosion, as a lot of people know, right? Except for a handful of companies. And then by, I went to EggRock in 97, we got acquired, I want to say in like 99. And then by the late 2000, we had a ton of, venture-backed companies as our customers, and they were all hemorrhaging cash when the stock market collapsed back then. And so, we were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do with Breakaway. And at that time, Dave came to myself and one of the other EggRock guys named VJ, who, was one of the founders of EggRock, and, was thinking about leaving and either going to another company or starting a company. And that was kind of the genesis of BladeLogic, right? And the real, concept behind BladeLogic was, geez, we have all these hosting customers, and we realized that every time we would make a change to a server, 1 out of 2 times, the servers would go down. And it was usually our folks causing the problem. The sysadmins were making a change and the software would go down and the servers would crash. And so, Dave, along with VJ and I, and there's one other guy named Steve, basically thought, geez, if we could create software that automated all this stuff instead of left it up to chance with the sysadmins, like there's probably a big business there. Like if we could really do that, because there's literally thousands of servers and it's growing exponentially with Moore's law and everything else. And so that was the genesis of BladeLogic. And luckily, because Battery had made an investment in EggRock, and VJ was one of the founders of EggRock, and I had worked at EggRock, and Dave, had done work in the past with Bessemer. Battery and Bessemer put a bet, behind BladeLogic and gave us our Series A round. And back in those days, Series A's were not that big. I think we got 6 million in our Series A round. One of the smartest things that Dave did was, he figured out and was able to, negotiate the acquisition of another kind of company with a few people in it, to basically give us the bootstrap of what, the company was going to be. And that was basically the start of BladeLogic.
Incredible story. Absolute incredible story. And so at that very early stages of BladeLogic, what hat are you wearing, Vance? Are you wearing the developing one? Are you wearing the ideas? You orchestrating this? What was that early stage role of yours?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't even know if I know the answer. It was interesting because Dave, brilliant, super hardworking guy, and all of the stuff we're talking about, a lot of it would not have come to fruition without him. He was based in New Jersey. VJ, myself, and the other guy were based in Boston. And we had made the decision to start the majority of the nucleus of the engineering team and a handful of the first few reps. We were going to try to start it out of Boston to have some center of gravity. And so when I joined the company, I basically, my title, besides being co-founder, was, I think it was VP of Product and Strategy, I think was my first title. VJ was the CTO, Dave was the CEO, the other guy was the BD guy, because he had, he was a smooth talker and could make deals happen. So, what's interesting is I was clueless. I had never really been formally trained in product management. But to Dave's credit, he was always a big, champion of mine, a big supporter of mine, because he knew that, I'd like to think that he knew that no matter what, I always had his back. And I was also a grinder. Like, no matter what, we were going to figure it out, no matter whatever had to be done. And so I did what came naturally to me from my prior 7-8 years in the consulting world, which was go talk to customers and go spend time with customers. If you sniff anything that might potentially be a customer in the future, go after them. And that's basically what I did. I spent, I'd say 70% of my time with customers and 30% of my time, trying to translate what it is they wanted and what I thought that really meant into some kind of feedback to, the engineering team and to VJ, and to collaborate with VJ to come up with a customer's view of what's really needed. And what happened early on was, because of that, I ended up, we had hired our first sales guy who wasn't a PTC guy. He had come from, I think, a company called NetIQ. And we're like, oh, this is a NetIQ guy. He sold tons of stuff. It's on the Microsoft platform. Well, we didn't really know back then that, he's as good as a sales guy he was. The sales process at NetIQ was you'd walk in someplace and say, hey, do you guys have, Windows? Oh, well, you need NetIQ. Right? That was sales qualification. And so early on, with some of the early customers and prospects that we worked with, I spent a ton of time with them. And what happened was we ended up getting in an RFP. This is, early days in October. So we got our first round of funding, September 6th, 2001. So 5 days, our first management meeting was on September 11th. So literally, you talk about like markets and timing. If we had not raised the money, if 5 days later, we would not have started the company. And so, sorry for being long and winded here. what happened was we started working with a few companies, but there was one company we got in an RFP with, which was one of the large, still one of the large telcos today, but it had a large hosting business. And, you name some of the, top 3 or 4 cellular providers today. That's one of the companies. It's just Sprint, right? We were working with Sprint, and they had this big hosting business. And so I basically, flew down to Maryland and camped out there every week for the next 2 months. And I hired a product manager, great guy named Derek. And he was down there and he camped out for the next couple of months. And we just spent every day, all day, basically trying to show them that, yes, we had a real product that they could buy. And it's a much longer story than that I'm not going to get into. But long story short, we've been working with the company for 3 months. We had dropped our first version of the software and they laughed. I mean, they were like, are you kidding? The thing didn't work. I brought it down on my laptop. It didn't function. Like, you couldn't deploy files. You couldn't do any compliance. You couldn't provision the server. I mean, all the stuff we said it did not do, with a couple of examples that I could dance around. And so, fast forward, we're getting to the end of the year and it's our first real quarter in business. And we'd only closed a handful of deals, I'd say all in a couple $100K of software deals in our first full quarter as a company. And, we're all kind of looking around and Dave said to me like, hey, we got to figure out how to get a deal out of this Sprint. Like, we need some more bookings. And long story short, I went to the economic buyer, who I didn't even know, if he was the real economic buyer. I didn't even know what a champion was back then. I basically went to him, I said, Dave, like, we're going to have a real problem if we don't get a deal by the end of December. And this is like 2 weeks runway. We're talking 3 weeks maybe. And I said, like, I've committed this deal. You have to come through with an order. And we went back and forth. They had all of these asks. Like, he expedited trying to get a contract done. It had to be on their paper. And he had all these asks about giving warrants to them in our stock and all this crazy stuff that Dave had to keep going to the board on. And long story short, a fax, this is back when you had fax machines, a fax came through the fax machine in our tiny little fishbowl office in Boston. And the number was like, I think it was over 700,000. I mean, it was huge. It was like 3 times what it had already done. And so it brought our first quarter somewhere close to $1 million. I don't know if it was a full million exactly, in our first full quarter of business. And Dave, to his credit and savviness, he went back immediately. I say immediately, it took a couple of months, and he got a Series B round at a significant increase in valuation. And he went outside and got that round. And we were off to the races, right? In spite of ourselves in some way, but you look back, you kind of make your own luck, right? We worked our tails off. Engineers were working around the clock. Dave was working his tail off. I was never home. My wife didn't even know what cities I was in most of the time. But that, boom, we got a Series B and we're like, okay, we can do this. Like, we went from September 11th, we can't even go to a trade show or talk to anybody, to we just did $1 million and we're going to go raise another round, and we got it. And it was a big up round and we were off to the races. And so that's kind of what got it started, right? I would call that like mini phase 1.
Yeah.
And, so then we got to the point where it's like, okay, that was, sheer effort-based selling and product development, right? So, again, to Dave's credit, always looking for how do we make this organization better? He found the first PTC sales guy, right? And again, to Dave's credit, he had gotten a great advisor on our board before he became a board member, a guy named Steve Walski, who was the PTC guy. And Walski, was great at helping us find people and vetting people, and just a really sharp guy. And Dave hired the first PTC sales guy. I remember interviewing this guy, and he's like, hey, I need you to meet this guy. I met with him, and I walked into the room and I'm like, is this the guy I'm interviewing? I mean, he was huge, like no neck, head, shoulders, just huge guy. And I'm like, this guy could not possibly be a good businessman. He's way too huge. He has not enough time on his hands. And then I started talking to the guy. I'm like, wow, he's actually very sharp and very, intellectual and knew way more than I did about selling. And it was asking me questions that I was just embarrassed by, because I was so exposed at how bad of a sales guy I was, even though I'm like, oh, we sold this $700,000 deal and we're awesome. And we hired this first guy, and within the first, it was a grind. Like he, right out of the gate, he basically did things that were like the McMahon playbook, because this is a McMahon disciple, right?
Yeah.
Things like blowing deals up, sending blow up letters to like major executives of company and telling them how, they're at risk of violating X, Y, and Z law. And it was great. But one of the best things about it was the right time, because we were in just a knife fight against Opsware, right? And so Mark Andreessen, and the founder of the internet, would fly around in his private jet, and he would basically go in and tell all these CIOs why they had to be partnered with Mark Andreessen. And then those people would call Gartner and say, okay, well, who's the best company in this space? And they're like, well, if you're going to look at Opsware, you have to look at BladeLogic. And then the early foundations of our PTC sales team came in and would blow those deals up and say, what, are you crazy? You're going to go with a company that the software doesn't even work? Or are you going to go with BladeLogic, who has 10 of the best customers in the industry and will work every time? And that was basically kind of the first eye-opening view, like, okay, there's actually a science, to sales. Like there are things you actually learn that are really make a difference in how you go after it. And it was, and I got a lot of that even, before I got stepped up to a whole new level when John McMahon joined, which was fascinating.
Well, tell us about that transition, because obviously Steve Strahan kind of came in, and then he was followed by John. So just talk to us about that kind of transition.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, like, again, credit to Dave. Like he always, he was, if there's anybody who would like listen to his gut and rip the Band-Aid off quickly, it was David Echeria, right? Like if things were not working, and even if they were working like 5 out of 6 cylinders, he always wanted to take the 6-cylinder to an 8-cylinder. And so, when we had Steve was much more of, I would call it an artist than a scientist, right? Like he had the playbook, was a phenomenal sales guy, was very charismatic. And so when it came to like hand-to-hand combat and helping his sales reps in deals and winning those deals, Steve was phenomenal. But when it came to, okay, we got to take this 4 or 5 person sales team to now 20, and then we got to think about 40. Like we got to have the playbook, and we have to make sure that we understand all the pieces to the productivity model, and how we train these people, and how we recruit them, and what are we looking for. And Steve had some of it, but he didn't have like, great guy, but didn't have the full package on when it came to scale everything to the next level. And so I remember Dave, and I was, I'd still like to consider myself a friend to Steve's. Like I brought Steve to Sumo, right? And quite an interesting situation. And, when Dave came to me and he said, hey, I need you to interview this guy named John McMahon that Walsky recommended. I met with him. He's really good. He's intense, but he's what we need. I was kind of skeptical, because, I'd heard rumors, because we had some other PTC sales guys who are my friends who, were kind of like, there were rumors on the street that McMahon was talking to us. And, they all kind of whispered me like, hey, McMahon is like, he's intense, right? And he's got this stare, like, all these, they probably told me all these other things, but that's what sat in my head. Like there's this intense, like death stare guy that I'm going to have lunch with. And that's all I was thinking about when I went to lunch. And so I remember sitting down with John, and I may screw this up a little bit, but basically we started out the thing, and I asked him out of the gate. I said, so, you're going to come in here and, screw up this whole company that we have. We've got this, we got a good thing going. We did this much. Why do you think that you can do any better? And I didn't say it exactly like that, but it was pretty, blunt. Because quite frankly, I'm blunt, and I was nervous. Like, I'm like, this is my whole life. I don't have any money. This is my whole life right here. And he just had this little John McMahon smirk that he has, which I love, right? And just kind of like, I didn't know it at the time, but in hindsight, I knew it was his acknowledgement that like, okay, I can work with this guy. Like he's not going to be, he'll come at me, and I like people that come at me. And then we had a great conversation, like just 1 hour at lunch, just the education that he gave me by me asking him questions about, what made him successful was just, it was fascinating. And I kind of, I wanted to believe in it because it just, it sounded so great, right? Like just, he made things that seemed insurmountable sound so easy, right? And if you just apply these steps and apply this recipe, on how you recruit and how you train and, how you put the managers ahead of the reps and how you're thinking about staging your business and all of those things. That was my first hour with the guy, and I've obviously, it's ingrained in me, and I've learned it over time through exposure to him. But, so John came in, and sure enough, the good thing was he had a handful of, solid reps that he had worked with in his past. They were already there. So, but then he said, okay, now I've got to go put in the framework, right? And get the right managers that if we don't have them, and I got to go get the right recruiting, and I've got to go get the right training and building upon what Steve had done, but really taking it to the next level. And it was just really, it was super, you could feel like things were just kicking into another gear because, it was a tough transition, as these things sometimes are. And certain people left, like I think our whole, the majority of our DC office left that was handling public sector because they were going to start their own thing. And there's just a lot of things that all of a sudden, when you're not a huge company yet, you're kind of looking at like, geez, is this going to be okay? Right? We're still early here. And then John got there, and we could talk about what he taught us and the playbook and all that stuff. But it was interesting. I just remember one, like in 2005, when the transition first started, I was thinking to myself, like, man, is this thing gonna make it? This, like, I got all my eggs in this basket. I've been here 4 years, and I had some health and personal issues during that time. And then all, and a bunch of people had left, because of the transition and their own things. And then all of a sudden, late 2006, 2007 rolls around. And I remember going to a management meeting, and Dave, starts talking about, preparing for the IPO. And I'm like, it almost seemed that abrupt, like that it was happening. And boom, then we went public, and then we were acquired, right? And a lot of stuff happened, in between. But what always happened, no matter what, is the ability and confidence of John and Dave to believe that every quarter we were going to beat the previous quarter, and that even if things didn't look like rosy, no matter what, it wasn't a problem. We were going to overcome it, and we did. Like, I remember one quarter when the numbers were coming in, and they're like, they didn't look great, and all of a sudden John said, I want to say he said we had like a $6 million deal, right? It was like a huge number, bigger than we had done before, and it was one guy in Seattle, and it wasn't like, I don't think the guy had done any other deals before that at our company. And all of a sudden, boom, it's like, okay, click it in. Now we're doubling the number of sales reps. And so there was always like, because back in those days, you didn't have, like, there weren't a lot of product led, kind of moves. We didn't really have an inside sales. Every penny that we had, it would go to a sales rep or to an engineer, right? We had one sales ops guy we got out of school that John hired, from Bentley. We had like 2 marketing people. I mean, everything went for a quota carrier, because, I think we raised 24 or 26 million total, and the whole run up to the IPO that Dave raised. And so it was fascinating, just to see that in action.
It's so interesting. And so just going back in a little bit of time there, just before the IPO happened, which was 2005 to 2007, right?
Yeah.
At that point, with John behind the helm of the sales, was it as kind of, you were so bought in that you just literally stood to one side and let John do what needed to be done? Was it as simple as that? Or was there any pushback to say, come on, because as you said, this is your business, right? And it's kind of like,
Yeah, and I mean, so from my standpoint, I I I mean, certainly at my level, because I was not the CEO, like it wasn't like I was pushing back. I mean, I stepped back and I looked at it and I'm like, this guy has so much more game than I do when it
yeah,
comes to selling, and growing a sales force. It's like, it's like a dad and his child, right?
yeah,
So it's not like I'm gonna push back on my dad. I know there was always trade-off discussions when it came to, and that was the beauty. Dave and John were super collaborative, since then, but certainly the beginning of it, it was off to a very roaring start. Um, but the main pushback was, hey, the tension that people felt was, hey, if we have $1, we really like to use 90 cents of it, and the thought process was, every dollar that we beat the plan by, Dave would take 50 cents and reinvest it into people or things that we needed, and 50 cents would go to the bottom line. Right. And so we were always kind of cash flow neutral, give or take, thanks to Dave's, very savvy management of the business. But that 50 cents that we're going to invest in the business, there was always tension around, okay, we really want to take 45 of it and put it towards sales and sprinkle the other 5 towards other things. And so we were definitely a sales-led organization.
right.
And there was definitely tension. Like we did not have as enough engineers. Now, in hindsight, it was very good success. So you could argue you had enough engineers, right? We didn't have enough marketing people. Well, in hindsight, it got what we needed from a sales standpoint. But I would say that was the primary tension. People were bought in, but you have limited money, and it wasn't like today where you go out and you raise $100 million round, or some crazy number, right? It's you're taking the handfuls, the few million that you have that you beat the plan by, and you got to sprinkle it around to those reps. And to John and Dave's credit, John's ability, because he talks about recruiting, but his ability to recruit somebody with 50 cents compared to our competition that would try to recruit them with $1 was unbelievable. Now, part of that goes to the fact that everybody knows that he was the guy that had all this success here and in his past, and was the guy that people wanted to follow. But it was clear, like even our competition, the guy running sales at our competition, he was hired and fired twice by John at PTC, right? Like people knew the A team was at BladeLogic when it came to sales. And so a lot of people wanted to try to figure out, how do I become part of that team? At least that's my view of it anyway.
That's great. So I know that one of your playbook elements is hiring athletes. And the reason I bring this up is because obviously this is something which was the blueprint at PTC, and obviously John McMahon really advocated that at BladeLogic. But I suppose my point to that is, were you culturally aligned in terms of what you wanted to do, or did you have to realign to the kind of the direction that you were kind of being pulled?
No, I mean, I would say I was never like, I felt like I was shoehorned into something that I wasn't comfortable with. It was more, taking what I knew based on my own experiencing, and taking the coaching that I saw from the value that people like John and Dave brought to the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And doing with it, and I'll tell you like a very interesting story as it relates to that, and who you hire. We had very early days when John got there, there was a brother team that was in sales and pre-sales at our company, good guys, and one of the brothers was a sales manager in a territory, and one of them was the pre-sales guy. And both smart guys, both had plenty of experience. But the pre-sales guy, basically came in and took over the pre-sales organization. And up until that point, I had been running it. But then I was asked to move on and go focus on marketing and getting our services business off the ground. But all of the pre-sales guys used to kept coming to me, and I would see it firsthand in deals like, okay, we're taking like 2 or 3 steps backwards here. And I could just sit back and just let it unfold, or I could, this is my baby, right? This is my company. Like my whole life's wrapped up here. I got to talk to McMahon. I just went into the office and I said, hey, John, I'm concerned about this. And I talked for like 30 seconds. This isn't working. And here's what I'm seeing. And, we might want to think about blah, blah, blah. And I tried to be, professional about it and all that stuff. And John didn't even say anything to me. He just picked up the phone and he said, hey, yeah, you work for Vance now. Boom. That was it. Literally like, V-Man, anything else? I'm like, I guess not. No, that's it. Right. So John was always like, hey, he probably had something in his gut that he already knew, but he also trusted people, when he trusted them. And he just was always, he'll talk about just getting at the desk and clearing everything off the desk every morning. Like it's a classic John, euphemism. And that's what he would do at any time. Like if it's a problem and he could find a way to solve it immediately and it was the right thing to do, he would solve it that second. And so back to your question, I always found like it wasn't that I had to think a lot about, oh, am I being pushed in the wrong direction? You're in a knife fight like every day, right? When you're in that kind of environment. And so you just solve it, right? Okay, it's not working, go solve it. This huge bank that you just sold a huge multi-million-dollar deal, not a single thing works, go solve it. Your IPO is about to launch. I mean, to give you another example, the day of our IPO, when we're going to, go to Wall Street and, you ring the bell and all that stuff, John and I didn't go. John and I were at one of the top analysts in the country because they were about to come out with a report that said we were number 2 behind our competitor. And that was unacceptable. So John and I went and met with the CEO of that company and met with the chief analyst and explained to him all the reasons that they were making a mistake. Because that was how Dave and John and the whole culture of the company, for the most part, was like solve problems when they need to be solved. That's priority 1.
Did you make the change? Did you become number 1 at that point?
Let's just say it was massaged enough for people to read that we were number 1 if they wanted to read it.
Nice.
A lot of ways to slice the numbers.
So I don't know at the time whether you had the opportunity to kind of reflect on what was going on around you. Obviously, we've heard the incredible stories of the sales team. We're currently recording, well, we would have released the pre-sales series by the time this episode would have come out. And those teams were truly, truly remarkable. Did you have the time to sit there and reflect on what you had, or were you just in a knife fight every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think she certainly had time to reflect, after the fact, when we got acquired by BMC. I mean, because again, that was quick. I think maybe we had 2 earnings calls as a public company, if that, and then BMC acquired us. So when you got to BMC, you were kind of, in a way, you were forced to reflect because, I know John and other people have shared this with you, but this tiny little company of whatever we were, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred people at the time, but only, 70 people in sales or something, ended up running half of BMC and all the go-to-market and sales and marketing and everything else. At that time, you're kind of forced to reflect like, okay, there's a reason we're here, right? Like we must have done something right. And pretty much the playbook that we ran at BladeLogic on a small scale, we basically put in and said, okay, let's apply this playbook, from everything to pre-sales and enablement and marketing and all that stuff, to BMCs, whatever, we had 24 products or something, right? Let's take our 1 or 2 BladeLogic products and take the whole concept and formula and bring it to BMC, certainly under John and Dave's leadership. And, certainly on sales, and Dave was the president of the ESM group at BMC for a while. And so looking back and reflecting, and when I've gone to other companies since, the like people don't understand like how nuanced and detail oriented you have to be to make all those other things work, right? Like, yeah, you can recruit good people, you know, if you're lucky and you're smart about it and you have the right story, but like, and you train them. Well, there's a lot that goes into that, right? Just the training itself, to give you a simple example, like, okay, what are you going to train them on? Well, what we really spent a lot of the time training people on differentiation, right? And like to this day, people can ask me, like, what are the differentiators of BladeLogic? And I'll be like, oh, configuration object dictionary, closed loop compliance. Like, we knew exactly what it was. And to get to those like 4 strategic core differentiators, besides doing minimum security with Kaplan and his group and all that stuff, like, you know, to get to that, you know, guys like me and Damon and other nerdy pre-sales guys are in the code, you know, in the software of our competition, knowing every nuance and putting it through its paces to figure out where we could trip them up in a proof of concept and where we could win no matter what. And so, you know, there's a lot of stuff under the covers, creating a, you know, a test plan, like what we call the killer test plan, that no matter what, if we do a POC and people execute this fair test plan, we will win that deal 9 out of 10 times. We could be way behind, get to the POC and run the test plan. We will win. And obviously you need, you know, the Paul McGraths and the Marty Carides and the Carlos Delatoris and all those guys to pull it off with all the pre-sales guys that we had. But you had to have the plan to begin with, right? And you had to have all those things. And so, you know, reflecting back, it's hard not to have an appreciation for just the stuff that you absorbed, you know, through osmosis via the, you know, PTC, McMahon, Dave way, right? And that part of it was brought and part of it was learned.
Amazing. So just take us to the lead up to the BMC acquisition. So what was the initial response? You've obviously just IPO'd, as you said, two, three quarters, and then BMC are on the table. So, you know, tell us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, I knew, so on the analyst calls that we're on, right? And obviously I don't know everything that went on behind closed doors as Dave did as the CEO, right? But certainly, you know, you knew when there was an analyst call and so on, that there was always 2 companies on the call, multiple people from 2 companies, BMC and EMC. And they were constantly, you know, and it wasn't like 1 or 2 people, there were multiple people constantly on these calls. And so you knew there was some interest there at some level, you know, whether it was just curiosity or real interest. And certainly, you know, some of these companies had leaned into us earlier on at much lower prices than the IPO was at. And so in the lead up to it, what basically went on is we had, you know, our great IPO success, probably one of the best in a decade. The, you know, very strong first quarter results. Our second quarter reporting with very strong results. But as a company, as a business, you know, we guided the classic kind of, you know, don't over promise kind of guidance. And, you know, the stock took a little bit of a hit on the second earnings call, not massive, but at one point we were trading over $1 billion. And then all of a sudden we had the earnings call and, you know, we guided probably a little lower than some people want us to guide because we were conservative. And that the stock took a hit right after that earnings call. And I think that was the signal for some of these folks like BMC to lean in and be like, okay, this may be our only chance. And so I remember Dave coming to my office being like, hey, you know, I got to tell you something that's confidential. And, you know, he let me know, like, this is what's going to happen. We're going to get acquired. And we had a discussion about it. And I think, you know, for me at that point, I don't think I had, other than selling a little stock and things like that, you know, at the IPO, very little. It's not like, I don't think the lockup had ended. I didn't even really even sold any stock. So I was still in, you know, like, okay, you know, I got to pay the bills mode and startup mode. And, you know, that never really changed. And then all of a sudden, boom, you know, we're going through the dance with BMC to get the acquisition done. Right? Like, hey, you got to go through the diligence. And, you know, I think it was their I believe it was their biggest acquisition at the time by far, right? I think it was probably 3 times more or 4 times more than they ever paid for another company, if I recall. And so, they're still kind of like, this is Bob Beecham. He's betting a lot on this acquisition based on the price tag. And so, when we had like the executive level meetings, part of it was, again, you're in sales mode again, right? You want everybody in that room to feel good about what they're about to do, as well as like, not just today, but 2 years from now, why this is going to be a massive business together. And all of a sudden BMC is going to be one of the top software companies in the world. That was our, mindset, right? And I remember having conversations with John and Dave about, okay, when we get asked these questions, let's talk about this, and let's talk about, this growth opportunity, and let's talk about, all the things that we've not executed on that combined we could execute on. And so, you're still, again, you're in a sales campaign. Your head's down during that process to try to get, certainly from a CEO standpoint, Dave's standpoint, he's got a whole other set of issues he's got to deal with, just getting the deal done. But when you're supporting that as an executive, you're a sales rep, right? You're trying to figure out, who are your champions? Who do you need to, who do you really need to help, get over the line? Who's a coach behind the scenes? And, we didn't talk about it like that, but that's what's going through my head. Like, you, Vance, are one of the sales reps in this process, and you got to help get this deal closed. And then, we got acquired, and, I think within like a week or two, there was a sales kickoff for BMC. And I don't even know if the deal was even closed. And I'm sure people have told you the story. Just, the contrast between the existing head of sales at BMC and John McMahon, and they had to speak on the same day. Right. And so one of them came in with like a wig on and played as a rock star. And then John McMahon came in and everybody was like, man, I am scared for our competition. Like, if this guy is even working with us at all, I am so scared for everybody outside of this room. That's how you felt after John spoke for 45 or 50 minutes. Right. And then everybody later, at the cocktail reception or whatever it was, the reception, I just remember all the BladeLogic guys talking like, what? When we were a tight group, it was like, well, man, what do you think's going to happen here? Like, are we just going to be our own little, island? What's going to happen? And then pretty quickly, all of a sudden, Dave's the president of the ESM division, which is all like server oriented stuff. John's the head of sales worldwide for BMC for everything except the mainframe business. And then, John's building his team like, hey, Vance, you want to go focus on marketing and pre-sales and channels, and and he put other sales leader into sales leadership positions. But all of a sudden I went from having like maybe it was a 10-person, 20-person team, I don't remember, to like hundreds of people. I think it was like 600 people or something that was just on my team, because our enablement team alone was like 45 people. Pre-sales with another were hundreds and hundreds of people. And so I went from startup mode to like, oh, we're in a multi-billion-dollar company, and now we got to make this thing scale and start growing again to 20 or 30+% or more. And, during that time, looking back on it, it never crossed my mind like, oh, this is daunting, because I was with my posse. I'm like, I get to work with John McMahon and Dave and Marty and Carlos and Scott and, all these guys and then all of a sudden John brought in, because he had the resources, he started bringing in more athletes, right? He brought in Jim Drill, and, he started hiring really good, first line managers. And all of a sudden we start going to these sales meetings where there's like a whole BladeLogic contingency, and very quickly things started to change. Like, you figured out, who's on the team and who's not going to wear the jersey. And John, was just masterful at making that transition happen in a very short period of time through a lot of political nonsense behind the scenes. It was very fascinating to see, but it's a learning experience. It was great.
Thank you so much for sharing with that part of the story with us, fans, because obviously, Now, we've heard so many interesting stories, but it's so interesting to hear the behind the scenes and what's going on and the conversations and the nitty gritty detail. And as a team, and we spent thousands of hours researching and understanding this story, and it's just amazing to hear what was going on behind the scenes. So thank you for sharing that, Vance.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So for you, obviously, you're now part of BMC. You've started VP Worldwide Software Consulting, which then you spoke about, and then you took on a bigger role, which is then VP Worldwide, the ESM Marketing and Sales Operations, which is where you ran that big team of 650, and then VP of Global Services, right?
Yes.
So taking on lots of different roles and lots of different disciplines, right? But adapting really easily to all of those.
Well, I don't know if I'd say adapting really easily.
Okay.
Adapting. Let's just say adapting.
Taking it in your stride.
No, I mean, and again, and this goes back to John and Dave. I don't have to mention their names too many times, probably, but so the way I got in that last role that I was in, and I never really thought that I was going to stay long at BMC, honestly, but because of it was interesting, it was fun, and a lot of the folks were there, as I mentioned. But I remember being like 2 years into it, and I think it was Dave that first mentioned it to me. Yeah, so Dave was still the president of the ESM business, and he basically had said, "Hey, we need to take our consulting organization, our global services business, which was a couple $100 million business, which is, think about doing all this implementation and nerdy implementation work, but we are also doing some strategy consulting to help people do IT transformation, right?" And he's like, we need a new leader there. You want to go run that? And I'm like, well, he's like, you were at Accenture, Anderson Consulting, like, just, you need to go do this, right? And I'm paraphrasing, but so Dave and I had a conversation. That was like on I think the end of a week, a Friday, and I was going back to him, and he's like, "You're gonna have to meet with Bob, the CEO." And I went back to him, and we were trying to work out, okay, what's the comp going to be, and what are the measurements and all that stuff, because I knew I was signing up for another 2 years, and you got to remember, this is now 2010, and I'd been heads down for approaching a decade of just working my tail off, traveling a ton. My kids went from age 1 to 10 in that time, and I spent very little time with them in the last decade. So I was basically trying to, Carol, and my wife, lovely woman, was like, "You really want to sign up for another one of these right now? Like, you have to start all over and, do all this work, and it's global, right? Which my previous role was, but you got to go transform this whole thing and fix a bunch of things." And so at the same time, I remember, I think, right when I started talking to Dave, he called me back and was, I thought, to tell me like, "Hey, okay, here's what the package is, and here's what we're going to do." And he basically said, "Oh, this is a different reason. I'm leaving." So, at that time, he basically left the company, and he said, "Bob wants to meet with you," or something to that effect. And I flew down to Houston, met with Bob. And Bob, gave me the sales pitch, like why this is going to be really great and why you need to do this and blah, blah, blah. And so, I went in and it was good and it was bad. Like, it was good from the standpoint of, like, it was all my show, right? Like, I had to go take everything that I'd learned over the last 10 or 15 years and apply it at a much larger scale. And I wasn't under, quote unquote, John McMahon's, wing. I wasn't reporting to him before I was in that last role. And so I was kind of mixed on it, because I'm like, okay, I'm not going to report to John anymore, but I am really his customer, because all his sales guys are griping that this is a problem and slowing deals now. And so I said, all right, well, I still get to work with John and the rest of the sales guys, and I'll go focus on this. And it was great. It was a great experience. Just really taking what John had taught about recruiting and training and just ripping the Band-Aid off and going and doing it in a whole other large organization. And making a lot of progress with it. So it was good.
Great. So I suppose, how important was that for you then, taking the next step? Obviously, you took a brief stint at TrueMotion as a CEO, and and then obviously moved on. So that was in Jan 2016, but then obviously swiftly made your way to Sumo Logic as president and CEO in May 2012. So tell us about how you had to transition and elevate yourself, and also how that really came about.
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I mean, so, basically I got to the end of my BMC run, and I went to Bob Beecham. I said, Bob, I think it's time for me to leave, right? I've been doing this hard for 10 years. I think it's time for me to move on. Let's bring in somebody else. And at that point, John, I think, had already left. John had left. Luca had taken over for him, who was a guy who was who ran Europe for us at BladeLogic, and great guy, Luca, that I've worked with for a long time. And but at that point, the home front, it was kind of like, hey, we'd like to have you do a little, recruiting and enablement here at home. How about you do that, right? So we came to an agreement that I would take a leave of absence from BMC, right, and then I could just figure out, like, am I coming back or what have you. Came home, and I remember I would talk periodically with Dave and John, and Dave had gone to be a VC at one of the top VCs on the West Coast. And I remember him, and at that time, being a CEO had never even dawned on me. I'm like, well, I've never been a CEO. It's not something I don't even know if I really even, like, in my head aspired to do that. But I remember Dave just saying, hey, there are a lot of companies in our portfolio, and some of them need a CEO, right? They're bootstrapped with founders, and we have good investments in them, but they need CEOs. Why don't you come talk to some of the leaders here at the company? And there were actually two opportunities that I looked at. One was Sumo Logic, and there was another, and that was based in Silicon Valley, and I lived in Boston. And there's another one in the East Coast, which was based in Boston. And one was going after the data analytics and the machine learning space, and one was going after the developer community with a whole new kind of app server platform and other things. Both backed by the same VC, both kind of similar. But, as I went and interviewed for both of the roles, my gut told me, like, the best market and the best opportunity for your skill set is the Sumo Logic opportunity, right? Like, it has a lot of, same kind of buying patterns, same kind of economic buyers. It's in the infrastructure space. But I was torn, be honest, because all of a sudden I would have to go to my family and say, hey, we're moving to California. And I got two kids just entering middle school. And, my wife's like, you've just been doing this for 10 years. You take 2 months off, and now we're going to move to California. Like, it's like, whoa, hold on a second. But, one of the best decisions I ever made. It was hard, no question. But when I got there, the setup when I got there, backed by two, of the best investors in the world, Greylock and Sutter Hill, right? And when I talk about, finding the right market and the right people. So when I went out and interviewed, and then there was a subsequent meeting where I brought my wife out so she could kind of, look around and see, like, what this was all about and meet some people. The guy who drove us around was Mike Spicer, right? Who was the Sutter Hill guy, who started Snowflake. He was our Series B investor at Sumo. And just, you talk about good people, just a great guy, right? Like, introduced me to his wife, like, right out of the gate, a great family. And, he just drove us all around and showed things that we didn't really know. I mean, we're East Coast people. We didn't, and really did a phenomenal job of ingratiating himself to me and to my wife, and making us feel like, hey, this transition won't be a big deal. Like, you'll have a support structure. And so, and just through my exposure, spending time, because he spent the majority of the time, driving us around and doing the recruiting, it was clear, like, this is a guy that I would love to work with. You talk about Dave and John, like, this is another guy of this caliber. And so that kind of cinched it for me. I remember Carol and I going back, flying back and on the plane talking about it. And she's like, what do you think? And I didn't even get the words out of my mouth. And she's like, we should probably move. And that's basically what happened. And when I got there, I think we had, I'm trying to think how many people were there. There was one one sales guy, one guy, Mark Musselman, who you guys have talked to,
Yeah.
who had been calling me. I was still at BMC, and I remember him calling me. I was on a deal in Europe, and he basically said, "Hey, are you coming or what?" And I had not, I'd not accepted the position yet. And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm still working out with Carolyn, and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. He's like, no, dude, you got to decide, because, I've already committed, and, you need to come. And so it was great when I got there. Mark was already there. I think he was 1 week before me. And it was Mark, myself. He had said, hey, I've already talked to these two folks, and, you got to talk to them, and blah, blah, blah. And so, it was like, okay, we had, I think, 2 beta customers, and that was about it. And it was like, okay, let's run, the bare minimum of what I remember and know about the BladeLogic playbook. Let's try to do it here, and at the same time, try to evolve with some of the nuances that were different, right? And so the first difference was I was the CEO and not one of the co-founders. So pretty much, you get a newfound respect for Dave and the CEO that you worked with before, because you have no idea what happens behind the scenes to pull some of this stuff off, whether it be, working with your board, raising money, hiring people, like just all of those pieces that you just kind of take for granted. You're thrown in the fire, and that's what you do, right? And so right out of the gate, one of the smartest things that I did, what was supposed to happen, because Dave was, a partner at this VC that was one of the lead VCs, he was going to be on the board for that VC. And so I had another board seat. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go get John McMahon if he'll do it. And so out of the gate, I said, John, I need you to, would you be interested in doing this? And the great mentor and coach that he's been for me over years, he agreed, and he got on our board. But then at the same time, all of a sudden I found out that, Dave was, not going to be at Greylock as long-term as I had initially thought. And he didn't end up joining the board, which kind of put me in a little bit of a pickle, because I'm like, geez, I really wanted both of these guys. Because the CEO mentor that I really needed on the board, I didn't have him on the board, right? I had great investors. I had John, but as somebody who's been the CEO and done it successfully and taken a company public, like that's a very unique skill set that I was really banking on having. And it didn't materialize just because of the dynamics of, the investors and Dave's new role and all that stuff. And so, just trying to navigate, okay, let's just, best way to make this successful is be successful, right? And so that's what I did, through the sheer effort and determination of Mark's artistry. And, he and I tag team and hired some good sales folks out of the gate. And again, you're trying to convince folks, to come and believe in you, because the product's still early. So you got to use what you have in your deck, right? You got to say, hey, look at these investors. There's something good here. You've worked with me before, and look at this market, right? Let's go do it. Well, you're competing against companies that may be a few years ahead of you, right? You're competing against that same talent at App Dynamics, at Okta, at some of the other, plays. And Dave had not joined Mongo yet, but, thank God, because I'd be competing against Mongo to try to find some of those folks. So you're starting to convince these people to like come over here on, a belief way before, they're going from running, maybe hundreds of millions of dollar numbers to, hey, we don't even have 200K of bookings. So, you got to do it. Now is my responsibility from doing it from scratch, and trying to do that, with Mark. And at the same time, you had to figure out, okay, well, what's the new play now that we're 10 years later in the future? And you have to adapt, right? You can't be stuck in your ways. You have to learn. And John and Dave will talk about this, a lot. Like there are a lot of people who just rely on what they knew and don't adapt. And in the case of Sumo, one of the things that changed it was cloud, right? And so, you weren't selling software, you're selling subscription agreements, and the terms and the contracts are different. Well, there's a lot of benefits to that. There's a lot of downsides to that in the early days of cloud. I'm basically going the same week that I moved to California to go to Sumo, Splunk went public. Our number one, enemy went public. So people are like, oh, that's on-premise software, that's old school. This was still a new shiny toy. They're like the big darling on the block. And so I'm going into a huge market where I'm trying to establish ourselves as the clear number 2 player with nothing, no bookings really to speak of, against a company that's loved. And so, you all of a sudden have to figure out what is the core differentiation and how are we going to beat them in proof of concepts? And, you do things, you use your advantage on cloud. And we had, the other thing that we had going for us that, was evolved from what we had at BladeLogic was, R&D and engineering is a major thing in Silicon Valley. Like, that's no secret. And, Silicon Valley companies, there are a lot of marketing and engineering, but they have great engineering, and the good ones have great sales. Not all of the companies, that I've been affiliated with, can I say we always had great product and great sales. And so, we used both of those things, the capital that we had, the product that we were building, coupled with trying to figure out how to get, even a sliver of the John McMahon playbook into what we're doing, and using John's guidance and, as much as I could to go make that happen. And you learn a lot, but boy, it was great to fall back on just the playbook that I had learned at BladeLogic.
Amazing. So obviously you didn't stay to see the IPO because you did go off to leave in kind of Jan 2015, but at the time of recording this, Sumo Logic just IPO'd a few months ago, a couple of months back. How do you reflect on that? Is that you kind of proud of that? What's your thoughts of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm certainly proud of it. And again, this is where, like, you have to listen to your gut, and I believe that.
That's one of your playbook elements. You've mentioned it a few times, right? So listen to your gut.
Listen to your gut, right? Like, and I obviously learned that as on my own growing up, but it was re-emphasized in just watching Dave and John in action in my career. As you just make decisions, thoughtfully, but don't, if something's eating you, then you just have to address it head on, right? And, at that time when, looking back on the Sumo days, like, I left Sumo, in my head, sometimes I think prematurely, but at that time I listened to my gut, which was, hey, I got a family here who's sacrificed the last few years to move across the country. One of them's entering high school, and, I was ready for their next chapter, right? And it was not necessarily on the other side of the country. And so I had to, weigh that. And my decision was, hey, I got to do the right thing right now for my family. And that's the most important thing. And that's why I ended up leaving and moving back to the East Coast. Looking back at it, I'm still super proud. I mean, whether I was there the whole run or getting the company, off the ground to the first tens of millions of ARR, that I feel pretty confident that, we wouldn't be talking about an IPO today if, we hadn't done what we had done in the 3 years that I was there, whether it be raise the money that we raised or go close all the huge deals that we closed with some of these great companies and beat Splunk, head on many, many times, way before than we probably should have, to be honest. But it's just a great experience and quite frankly, a different experience. I built some great relationships with not only great salespeople, but some great engineers, right? A very balanced organization. So very pleased.
So having left Sumo Logic, you went and did a bit of consulting, kind of some board work, and then made your way to Boston Logic in December 2017. And you joined as the president and CEO. So do you want to just tell us about that journey and
yes, absolutely. So I mean, that's another scenario. So everything that I've done, in my career, most often it's because of like a firsthand experience that I'm having, right? In either, my job or my personal experience. So, BladeLogic, we were having problems at Breakaway. So BladeLogic got started because of that firsthand experience at Breakaway. BMC happened because of BladeLogic. Sumo Logic happened because of the people I was exposed to at BladeLogic. In my experience in the infrastructure space. In the case of what I'm doing at Property Base, literally 2017, my wife was, got into real estate. Our kids we were empty nesters. They were both away at school, and there was just the two of us. And she was basically said to me, hey, and she was much smarter than I am, more university experience, the whole 9 yards. She basically said, what am I going to do? I think off the cuff, I said, why don't you think about real estate? Like, you're really good with people, you're sharp. We've bought and sold a lot of homes over our lifetime and always had a difficult experience. And so she got into real estate and sucked me in, and helped her do everything from, help her with her website to, gathering data and research and all that stuff. And at the same time, a couple of investors reached out to me and said, hey, have you ever thought about going into a vertical SaaS company as opposed to enterprise? Because we have, this portfolio company that's in the real estate vertical that, we think could be a big company, but, there's a lot of industry shift happening. And, they went at it differently, like it was a growth equity play. We're going to go buy as many companies as we can buy and integrate them together and make just a massively successful company in that space. And that was, it scratched the itch, one, like to go do it from an equity-based standpoint and go buy companies and integrate them. Like I had done some of that at BMC, and I enjoyed it. And two, it was in a vertical that like I was experiencing firsthand and I'm interested in. And so that's really how that got started, right? And ever since, we've been acquiring companies and integrating them and improving upon the product through organic development and sales. But again, the same things that I learned at BladeLogic and the playbook, I apply here. Everything from, how do you recruit folks and sell them on what you have to sell them? How do you enable and train them? How do you move on from decisions quickly? How do you make sure you put your team ahead of yourself, and when you're coaching, and figure out what their personal wins are? All that stuff, I apply here. And both people that I've worked with in the past and new people that I have in the organization. And it's interesting because, in this case where you buy companies and you have a whole handful of people that may come into your org, all of a sudden you got to figure out like every 6 or 9 months, like, okay, how do I give them a sliver of what I've been lucky to learn, through my BladeLogic experience, or figure out how to move on and get the right people who, may already have a piece of that.
Just reflecting on the very beginning of this podcast, and you talking about the job and your father's first business in making hats.
Yeah.
And throughout this,
he still has that business, by the way. Still in that business.
Fantastic. But throughout this entire podcast, I have lost count with the number of different hats that you've worn throughout all the different roles that you've done, which is quite ironic in a way. But what would you say is what would you say is the favorite hat that you wear? Or is it you like wearing so many different hats?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So when I was at Anderson Consulting, I got the nickname on a couple of projects of Rudy, right? They used to call me Rudy. And I don't know if you've seen that movie. There's a movie called Rudy. It's like in the US, he was like a football player who wanted to go to Notre Dame. He could never get in. He was short, like 5 feet tall. He was not athletic. But he found a way like to get into the university. He walked onto the team and he made the team, and he got into one play, his entire career. And that one play, he sacked the quarterback of the other team. And it's a whole story, about, and he's the only guy, I think, it'll say at the end of the movie, you have to watch the movie, it's a great movie, where they carry the guy on, they carried him off the field because he was just so inspirational, right? And, I got that nickname because that was me. I was never like the 6'4" point shooter. I was, I always played a lot of sports and was good at those sports that I played. But at the end of the day, I was a grinder. Like you put me in something and I will grind my way out of it and figure it out and work as hard, if not harder, than anybody to make it successful. And not every time will it be successful. And so, for me, having all those different experiences from programmer to consultant to, sales and sales enablement and you go down the gamut, to CEO now, like I think it's the fact that I've been, you know, all these different experiences. It's hard for most people to just like pull the wool over my eyes in anything that I'm talking about with them. You know, whether it's, you know, how we're going to solve churn or customer satisfaction issues, or, you know, how we're going to drive, you know, bookings and increase in productivity, you know, how we're going to put this marketing program together, like having all of those things and doing a lot of them firsthand. You know, even though I may not have been the best at all of them, like it's been super valuable and I like it. Like it's, you know, it's something new, and you can always feel like you're adding value, and you always feel like, you know, the team that you're working with, like you can give something to them, even if it's just a small sliver of what you learned in a lot of different areas, right? And so I think like it's a different path than certainly some people have taken, but it's worked for me.
Incredible journey, Nuns.
So just before we do ask the last question, I suppose if you were to reflect on everything you've achieved in your career, what is it you're most proud of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, there's not one major thing that I'm, you know, specifically proud of outside of personal things in my life. You know, I think there are a lot of little things that I reflect back on as an aggregation that build up to a big thing, and that's, you know, the personal experiences that I got and formed relationships, which I hope, you know, were good relationships with everybody from the, you know, the John McMahons and the Daves and the Pauls and the Marty Cardis and Carlos Delatoris, like anything that they did to help me and get me where, like that's why I've been lucky to get where I am, is because of those people. And there's a whole bunch, you know, Chris Healy and Mark Musselman, and there's so many people that I could name that I've come into contact with, you know, the Mike Spicers of the world, that, you know, I'm super proud of just those relationships. And I hope, you know, they feel like it was worth their time spending time with me.
Lovely answer to the question.
Amazing answer. And Vance, you know, I'm going to ask you the final question, which is, does the hunter make the unicorn? And I think it's quite interesting in your situation, because you've made multiple unicorns. So, you know, in your opinion, does the hunter make the unicorn?
To be frank, if I was a gambling man and I had to put money on it, I would say like 8 times out of 10, the hunter makes the unicorn. You know, that answer changes over time. You know, back 10 years ago, when you look at enterprise software, you know, they're great products, but a lot of the great companies had just great approaches to going to market. You know, and whether you look at, you know, small ones like BladeLogic, or you look at mid-sized ones like PTC, or you look at massive ones, you know, like Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft had a really good product, but, you know, their go-to-market was killer in its own way, right? And similar with Oracle. You know, Oracle had a very good database. Sybase was pretty good too, right? But they had a go-to-market and hunters that could figure it out. And so, you know, if I was, you know, I'd like to have both. Is the bottom line. It would be ideal to have both. And the companies, you know, in a long-winded answer, the companies that are blowing up huge right now have figured out how to do both, right? You know, and like Snowflake is a great example, right? Have figured out how to do both, and look what happens. You know, I would put MongoDB in that category. Figured out how to do both, and look what happens. And so, but certainly, you know, if I could only choose one, I would lean towards the hunter.
Amazing. Well, a very good place to end the session, Vance. Just before I do thank you, I just want to finish with a bit of a summary on what we've heard. And I'm actually going to steal Ollie's analogy about the hats, because I think it's really so fitting, pun not intended, in the sense that obviously you are probably, without question, one of the most humble people we've ever had on the show. And the reason I say that is because you're multiple CEO, president, multiple IPOs. There's so much for you to be proud of. And your whole career, you have been the chameleon. You've never been the one in the limelight per se. You've always surrounded yourself with great people. But I think what you perhaps haven't had the time to reflect, or I don't know whether you have the time to reflect, is perhaps how much you've helped those people become better. And, maybe if you did have some time to think about, the impact you've had and the reasons why people like Dave and John and, so many of these people did believe in you, is because you were able to bring so much variety. You were able to bring so much to the table, wearing those different hats, take on those difficult tasks, but grinding through, as you've said, and doing it for the right reasons. And I think that is a true testament to you. And I just want to say how grateful we are, and really, really thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, because it has been really inspirational and just a great, personal moment for me. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Vance.
Yeah, Simon, Ollie, I kudos to you guys for coming up with this creative approach to telling this story and using it for not only your own good, but I think it's for the good of a lot of folks. And I appreciate the kind words. Certainly, again, I go back to my first playbook item. Like, it's always, there's a lot of things you can land in the right opportunities and be lucky, but the more you can, connect with good people, the more, happiness and success you're most likely going to have. And certainly, I feel like it's another example. I've been able to connect with some good people here in my short time interacting with you. And I wish you guys best of luck. And I'm sure we'll have, some contact in the near future.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you very much from me.
All right, boys.
Vance.
Thanks again. We'll see you.
Thanks, Vance.